Welcome. So at this point, I want to start by telling people that the next three architects that we're covering today in today's lecture are the most important of all the architects we're covering this semester. And of course, therefore, in the topic of 20th century architecture, which itself is longer, 2 weeks, right? Instead of one, than all the other subjects. What does that tell you? Make sure you study the slides that I don't end up cutting from today's lecture on the final, because it's almost a guarantee. Hi, welcome. Yeah, we're just getting started. Almost a guarantee that, well, no, there is. I'll tell you for sure. Probably two of them. In fact, why don't I just say two of the slides we're going to cover in the next hour and 15 minutes on today's syllabus will be on the final. One probably in the slide ID section and another one in the slide analysis section. Okay, so that's important to make sure you take good notes and study them, of course, and I'll repeat that when we do the review, as always, before we cut the list during the review 1 week before the final. Okay, let me do the speaker view. And as usual, I like to at least give everyone who's here, to start a chance to ask any questions that you might not have had answered already by email about anything related to extra credit, grades. I'm not going to repeat all the extra credit options. I went over those in detail, of course, on Monday, and those will be, if you didn't catch that or missed the beginning of that lecture, it'll be posted on YouTube, let's say by Saturday morning, sometime late Friday, usually by 8 p.m. Friday. So if you check after 12 noon on Saturday, you'll see both of these, this lecture and the one on Monday. And they're very important because, as I just said, at least two architecture slides will be on the final. Let's see, do we have someone else here? Yes, good. Welcome. I think I was maybe a tad late, 3 or 4 minutes possibly, in sending you guys the invitation. I was meeting with one of my readers from my in-person class who had already returned papers and those grades I needed to verify. Like I said, I don't just assign a reader certain portions of each class's papers and then just forget about it and just log the numbers in when they return them by either in person, if it's for the in-person class, of course, or in your case with Zoom classes, it's done electronically. Before I forward them to you, your grade, I check the reader's work always. And sometimes you'll notice I've occasionally added some points. Here's my policy about that. If a reader makes a mistake in your favor, it stays, because that's someone I hired, however, authorized, what do you want to say, approved to do the grading, and that shouldn't mean, oh, I see they gave you too many points in this category, I'm going to lower that student's grade. I never do that. But if it's the other way around, when I check, and I always do, the work and the total numbering, right, addition, I guess it's called, of those readers, if they're off or they didn't give credit for some part of an answer that I can see was correct, then I add those points before I send you your grade on both papers and exams, just in case that wasn't clear. Okay, before we start today's lecture, because we have quite a bit to cover and it's a pretty rich vein of information about the first woman architect, the first green architect, and the first right hand of God, Frank Lloyd Wright. That's what he called himself, the right hand of God. I'll explain that when we get to the first two slides of Frank Lloyd Wright. But first, any questions anybody has at all about grading, extra credit, or the topics that we covered on Monday? Okay. All right, so let's get started now with the first must know. And boy, is this one a very, very high probability. If I was in Vegas, I'd say you could put your money on it that this could be, I'm not saying it will be, but easily, very likely to be on the final. Okay, let's move this and enlarge the image. And I grew up walking past this house every day on the way to grade school when I was growing up on the south side of Chicago. It was in my neighborhood, and I would pass by it on my way to primary school and middle school. In fact, it's an international landmark. So let's start with the title, as always. Well, first, the architect, Wright. And of course, that's the last name of Frank Lloyd Wright, but you only have to remember the last name. And you probably know how to spell it, but just in case you haven't ever written it, Wright. And of course, it was Frank Lloyd Wright, but you can just write the last name. And then the title of this work, this house, is the Robie House. Robie, Robie, house, 1909. Here's the first fact about it that makes it a list, or it is, sorry, this site is, that's how you should say it, listed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Well, a house, a private residence, not the White House, right? Or some palace. No, a single family home, that's really rare. In fact, as of 3-4 years ago, last time I checked, there were only 2 single family homes anywhere on earth that were on UNESCO's World Heritage List. This one and the other one by Frank Lloyd Wright we're going to see afterwards, Falling Water, which is even more famous, I'm sure, because it's such a unique house. So why is this one so important? Why is this house on the UN's list of World Heritage Sites? Because it's considered to be the prototype for modern houses, or the modern house is the phrase they would use. Or another way to say that or write that is just say many historians consider this to be the first truly modern house, period. No qualifying phrase. What does that mean? Hi, hang on just a minute. Let me get. Yeah, Jeff, we're just starting with the first line, right? This is right at the top of the page there, right? Robie House, I already spelled it right, 1909. Okay, so why do we call this the first, or many historians call it the first modern house, or the prototype for the, quote, modern house, unquote? Because it innovated, that's one way to say it, it introduced, is probably grammatically more correct, it introduced many features that are now common in houses being built all over the world. So let's talk about those things. But before we get to that, we need to tell you what style it is. That's an important part of the meaning. It's called the Prairie School. I gave you guys, if you were here on Monday, if not, you definitely want to watch that lecture when it's posted by, late Friday night on YouTube. That Monday lecture, when I defined, or not defined, I listed, sorry, the 5, right? 5 main movements of early modern architecture. This is one. Okay, it's called the Prairie, 2 words, Prairie School, just like it sounds, Prairie School. Of course, that's spelled Prairie, just like a prairie. Well, what does that mean? That's Frank Lloyd Wright's new style of modern house. That's the other way to say it, in parentheses, i.e. Frank Lloyd Wright's version of, or creation, you can even say creation of a modern house. But what makes this so modern? Well, first of all, I'm going to do this since we have this ability here. See this building here? One of my friends lived in that apartment up there. I used to go visit him and look down at this house whenever I was at his, I think his bedroom was up there. That house is the same year as the Frank Lloyd Wright house. Look at how different they are, how radically different this house is. One critic at the time said it's almost as if an alien spaceship landed at this intersection, on an empty lot and was plunked down there by, beings from another planet. It was that different than any other architectural style that had ever been invented. So what is the Prairie Style? That's the meat of this part of this lecture on the meaning of this slide, the most important facts. So what marks something as Prairie Style? The one that Frank Lloyd Wright, he coined that term. It was his name for his own style of early modern houses. Well, here are the features. There are 3. Prairie School, or you can just say Prairie Style houses, had 3 features. And the first one would be a sweeping horizontal lines and massing throughout the building. You could just say period. I'll repeat that slowly. Sweeping horizontal lines and massing, right? The shape of it, in other words. You probably should say throughout the entire building. The whole building is oriented toward, well, the prairie. If you've never been to the Midwest, most of you probably haven't, but those of you who go up there, no, there ain't no hills. I mean, in a few parts of the Midwest, but mostly it's flat. That's called the prairie. That's why he called this style the prairie, because it integrates with the site, the environment. It's flat. There are no hills in Chicago. anywhere. Okay, so all of the landscape is flat prairie. So we call it prairie style because the houses themselves have these sweeping horizontal lines and massing everywhere. All right, the second feature, all right, uh, is, okay, um, minimal ornament, subordinated to, comma, of course, it's a one sentence, minimal ornament subordinated to the horizontal lines. Now, what does that mean? Look at this. That's the only ornament you can see here, but there is one at each corner, right? They're flower pots. That's not functional. Of course, they're decorative. That's it. That is clearly an example of minimal ornament. Remember, this is the period right after the Victorian era ended. It's called Edwardian. You have to know that word, but that'd be the period when still people were still making decorative features, like this house has stained glass windows, fancy dormers with peaked gables and, sculptural or plaster panels along the doorway around the entryway. He didn't do that. He, in other words, second feature, I'll repeat that, is minimal ornament subordinated to the horizontal lines. Okay, and then the third feature of prairie is an open or free flowing floor plan. There's your alliteration for today. That might be, you could just say, but open is what that means. So you probably should write that exactly this way. Again, the third feature of Prairie Style or Prairie School houses is an open or free flowing floor plan. Now, that would be more obvious if we walk through this house. So all I can do is tell you what that means is one room flows into the next, and the doorways between the rooms, when they're open, allow an unobstructed sight line. Now, that's only on the common rooms, not the bedrooms. You want privacy in your bathroom and bedroom. So they still had, walled in rooms for the bathroom and the bedroom. But the dining room, the living room, the library, the study, there's like 4 rooms. I've been in this house many times. This house is one of the main tourist attractions in Chicago, by the way, for those who care about architecture. It gets 500,000 people a year. Hundreds of thousands of people a year come to see this from all over the world. A group of Chinese architecture students, as in mainland China, not Taiwan, communist China, were there when I was there a couple of visits back. And they were getting off of a bus, and it was all being, the lecturer was a professor, I'm sure, from some university. I mean, it just proves how well known this house is all around the world among anyone who studies architecture or urban design. So again, the free-flowing floor plan means that the main rooms, you could say, are common rooms, on the main floor. It's a 3-story house. You can see that. There's some servants' quarters and workshops here. Then there's the common rooms, and then the bedrooms upstairs. The main or common rooms on the main floor all open into each other. And you could see from one end of the house to the other. No way was that ever done with Victorians. Well, maybe once in a while, but that's not typical. Victorian architecture, as many of you know from living in or have visiting Victorian homes, right, from the 1800s, are all closed in with dark, cluttered space and lots of ornament on the walls and the fireplace. Personally, I kind of like that style, but that isn't at all what Wright was doing. Wright was abandoning the idea of ornament for ornament's sake. He didn't believe that was appropriate, that a building should fit its function. And so in that sense, another fact about him, and then we'll do one last thing about the meaning that is important, which is that Wright had been a student, well, isn't the right, student something he sat in a classroom, and he never did. He was a protege, an employee of Louis Sullivan. Remember, we covered him as one of the first skyscraper architects. He designed Sullivan designed the Wainwright building, which is what we covered on Monday, the last lecture. One of the oldest skyscrapers remaining in the United States. So Sullivan was a very successful architect, in fact, the most successful American architect when he hired Frank Lloyd Wright. And that's not a minor detail, it's part of the meaning of this, because without that relationship, Wright's career would never have become so successful. He was given all the training he needed and support and clients, which he then stole. That's a fact. You could put it in your notes. He stole most of Sullivan's, when he left Sullivan's office to open his own, Frank Lloyd Wright took with him and did it behind Sullivan's back. And Sullivan never spoke to him again, ever. They were enemies from then on. It's almost like a Greek tragedy, right? One god spawns another, and then the younger god steals the thunder, whatever. In this case, it's client stealing, which happens in every profession, of course. But this time it was national scandal that Wright started his business after having, secretly siphoned off all these clients, offering them, whatever lower fees, whatever it was he did to get them to leave Sullivan. And Sullivan felt betrayed, of course. And that's how Wright started his own career. But the man was a genius. There's no denying that. Now, what's the last fact about the meaning of this that's really important? Well, actually, it's two things that are related. Look carefully. Let's get a close up again at the way the roof line here, which is part of that horizontal line, right? And some people think of this just a chimney, but the right word for this is utility core. So the last, say, two things you should finish with in your notes about the meaning on this are that this house introduced two new features. The free-flowing floor plan, you can't say Wright invented, but he popularized it, and he's the first one to use it on all his houses. That was his Prairie Style. All his homes had these features, his early homes. Okay, so we have a quote, two words, just like it sounds, utility core. No one had thought of that. And why does that matter? Because, hey, it's the Midwest. You ever been to a winter in the Midwest? You don't want to be outside, especially not if something breaks. So you have all the systems. The point is, what is utility core's purpose? It houses in a concrete shaft. That's what it is, really. Everything from the chimney, the fireplace, of course, system, and the wiring, plumbing, heating, all of the systems that run a house, that keep it, either cool in the summer or warm in the winter, are housed in one place. So if any of them breaks, they can be fixed more easily. And also they're protected more from the elements because they're housed in a thick concrete shaft. Might sound like a small detail that doesn't matter, but it is an important new idea. The other one that's probably the most visually arresting or striking, I guess a better word, is a cantilevered, and I think you've all heard that word, but don't worry how to spell it. Just write it how it sounds phonetically. C-A-N-T-I, levered, cantilevered, it's one word. Cantilevered roofline, no one had thought of that. Now you see it in houses all around the world, but he did that by putting cables into the concrete. No one had thought of this on any residential architecture, at least. For bridges, yes. Factories, maybe. Some large institutional buildings, but not on a private residence. So he's the first architect to use cantilevered roof lines with he called it pre-stressed concrete. You could put a truck on the roof and it wouldn't crack. This house has never had any failure of the roofs. I don't mean they don't leak. Yeah, they do, because they're flat, because of the winter and the rainy weather. But it's not about whether the roof leaks. It's about the fact that this cantilever is 15 feet. Look at that, 15 feet out over the deck from the walls, with no cable, no brackets, no columns. Nothing supports it. It should have collapsed years ago, shortly after the house was finished. But it doesn't, because he invented this concept of reinforcing the concrete with cables, and he called it pre-stressed concrete. But all you need to remember is the concept itself. Cantilevered, or projecting, if you want to say overhanging, that's fine. Roof lines were never ever used before this on any house. So when this house was completed, it was the last thing to say is why it was so influential. Because Wright was so already famous by the time he designed this, that it was illustrated, mostly photos, some blueprints, even drawings, by artists in magazines, dozens of magazines all over North America, Canada and the US, illustrated this house as a revolutionary new concept in residential design. Okay, so you get some idea why this is considered the first modern house. Formal analysis. We have the textures, or the rough texture of brick, right? And the smooth texture of concrete. And on the windows, of course, two more textures: smooth glass in the windows, of course, and rough wood framing. So it's four textures. real smooth glass and concrete, real rough brick and wood. No cemented textures. And then we have the rhythm, the windows. Look how many windows there are. In fact, walls of windows is what some critics call this, and some of them didn't like it, this style. But among those who were, trying to build themselves new houses, many of them went to write for their, next house or their newest houses because they heard about this one. These windows, obviously, they're all side by side with almost no wall, just the framing of the windows between them. So that creates rhythm, as do the cantilevered roof lines and the flower pots and the concrete trim. Because that could be considered decorative, of course, but it also functions as the top of the railings on each deck or balcony. This is a balcony here. Yeah. So those features again create rhythm. The concrete trim, the flower pots, and the windows. It is almost entirely stable. There are no curved lines, but it looks and feels dynamic, especially when you stand across the street like this person did with the photograph they took. It's not my photo. The lines sweep so far, in towards, the viewer and away into the, off toward the horizon that it feels like it's dynamic, but it's not. Every line is straight. So it is completely stable and it's totally symmetrical. If that's not obvious, if you stood right here and looked straight at it, you'd see it's an equal distance on either side of these cantilevered roofs from the center, from the middle wing, which of course is where the master bedroom and bathrooms and things are. Okay, and then we have color, warm, mostly warm. He liked warm colors. And then cool on the concrete trim, of course, and the shingles on the roof. Then we have the modeling. Here, there is modeling. I'd call it part of the design because of the intended shadows here. If you've never been through summer in Chicago, try going in August. No, don't go in August unless you have no choice. It's hot and humid. So to get cool, breezes passing through the house from those open, free-flowing rooms, floor plan, and shade from the very hot sun. It can get to 100 degrees easily in the summer, the Midwest. It's part of why he did these overhanging roof lines projected to cantilevered roofs. So those create shadows very deliberately, as do the windows here, which keeps the master bedroom wing cooler, right? So they're part of the design. So there is the natural modeling from the sun, but it is a feature of the architect, not just a side effect. The line's all visual. There's no carved line. It's on the edges of the railings here and around the windows, corners as usual. Most architecture has visual lines and this has no carved lines. And then we have, let's see, a single mass. Well, you could break it down and say the ground floor is the largest mass, but really not because of the roof lines. To me, it's the middle or main floor that feels like the largest mass, and then the ground floor, because this is a deck, it's a separate part. And then you'd say the third floor. For space, it's a 3-story house of about just under 5,000 square feet. Much bigger than it looks in this photo. Nearly 5,000 or just under 5,000 square feet, divided into various rooms on 3 floors. That's all you have to write about space. Okay, I think we covered everything. Modeling, texture, balance, yeah. Okay. Now, I'm trying to remember if I have Franklin. There it is. I don't know why I had this at the end, but let's do the 2 right slides back to back. But I think I'll use this one. It's such a nice photo, isn't it? But I'll show you the other one when we need to look at close-up. Okay, this is the next must know. Again, the architect is right. The WRIGHT, falling water is the title. That's a nickname, but it's stuck, so people don't even know the real name of the original owner. That's what you usually give as the name of a historic house, is the last name of the owner who built it. But not in this case. It's just called Falling, just like it sounds, 2 words, water, 1936. Now we get to the latter phase of Wright's career, in which he invented another whole style of modern architecture, residential. We're talking about most of what he did was houses. I think 90% of what he did was residential design. So this one is a whole different concept. The only thing it has in common with Prairie is that his houses, his later houses, do integrate or blend. You could say blend, but a better word is integrate with their site, with their environment. So environmentally sensitive design is a modern phrase that you could apply to almost all Wright's work, especially his houses. So this is environmentally sensitive. It integrates with the site, which will say, well, I'll go ahead and say it's in the mountains of Pennsylvania. Yeah, they have mountains, but they only go 4,000 feet above sea level, but they're mountains. And it's in Western Pennsylvania in the country, obviously, in the country. And it's over a waterfall. And the house was deliberately placed there by right. He had to convince the owner that it was a good place to build a house. And the owner was skeptical, but now once it was finished, it became world famous. And he was very glad he had hired A, Frank Lloyd Wright to design his home, and B, that Wright chose the site. Because they owned a bunch of land. This is the wealthy family in Pennsylvania that hired Wright. You don't have to know, but if you're curious, it's called the Kaufman House in more correct terminology. Kaufman was a department store owner, but you'll have to know that. The thing you do need to know is what style is this and how to identify it. It's a little less complex than Prairie Style. Usonian, that's again Wright's own phrase. He coined that term, Usonian. Usonian, which is the latter phase of Frank Lloyd Wright's residential designs, in which the houses used relatively inexpensive materials. He kept the free-flowing floor plan idea, continued to use it. So they had free-flowing floor plans like the Prairie did. And then also they were meant to be affordable because they could be built from materials that were interchangeable or less expensive. Well, that was a theory. In practice, Wright never stuck to a budget. You have to write this. He never stuck to a budget. I wrote a book on Frank Lloyd Wright. I think I mentioned that. It's in the libraries, in most libraries. And it talks about that. I talked to the people who had Wright design their homes, or the children or grandchildren of some of those earlier Wright houses here in California. And they all said, oh, no, he didn't stick to his budget. They would go double or triple what he said. But his goal was to make affordable, the reason he coined the term and the concept, he wanted to make affordable housing for, middle class, the masses, he called them, the middle class, the majority of people in America who could afford that. And then the materials would be, because the reason they'd be more affordable, supposedly, is the materials were cheaper. And the parts could be interchangeable. They could be, assembled on the site, in other words. And that part did work the way he said. The various sections of metal, concrete, and of course stone, you see this is stone, were first brought here from somewhere else and assembled on the site. And then finally, the free-flowing floor plan was so popular. I think I have an interior view of it. Let me see, maybe I don't. Thought I did. Yeah, no, you see a little more of it here. Yeah, let's get up close. You see the windows, again, the wall of windows, that continues on even more so with Usonian. The other term for this is ranch house. Many of you probably lived in ranch houses. I grew up, part of not my whole childhood, but for a few years, I lived in one in Illinois. Ranch house, right? Mass-produced houses, mostly wood frame with stucco, and then a lot of big windows, right? And supposedly with slab concrete foundations, that's another thing Wright helped pioneer. With Usonian houses, they all had concrete slab foundations, no basements, in other words. And then they would have these open, free-flowing floor plans. This house had all of those things, but since it was for a wealthy client, it's much bigger than most Usonian homes and nowhere near affordable. I think it was $100,000, even though that's nothing today. Back then, that was a lot of money. On this house cost something around that when it was complete by the time all of the design was done. And the waterfall is the main thing people notice. The house is over a waterfall because it was the most picturesque site. And so people who live in the house or come to visit can stand on the balcony, right? Or either balcony, right? Because there's two balconies, two levels, where you can look out over the waterfall and see and hear it. Except of course, maybe when there's a drought or the summer, dries up the creek. But most of the year you can actually see the waterfall. And that's why it's called Falling Water. It was an instant hit. He had people from all over the world asked him to design their homes after this. Was also illustrated, as you could imagine, in many magazines around the world. Okay, so that's the meaning on this. Let's do a formal analysis. Well, It is the view we'll use if it's on the exam. First of all, the textures are all natural, real smooth glass and metal. See, the window frames here are metal, which is cheaper than wood and easier to assemble. So that's part of what makes it Usonian. But anyway, they're smooth textures on the metal and the glass and the concrete, and rough texture on the stone. The color's warm on the concrete, and the windows are, well, do a closer view here, painted red. The metal is painted red, so obviously that's warm. The only things cool are the main walls, of course, which is probably half of the total exterior, which is the gray natural stone. And so that's real rough texture and cool colors. Okay, and then we have the balance. Well, if you stood in front of it, it wouldn't quite be balanced because this is your utility core we were just talking about, where the chimney and all the other service systems, I mean, are located. So it is unbalanced toward the left and toward the bottom, because it's obviously the third, it's 3 levels again. The top level is the narrowest, and then the middle level is actually the widest. So it's unbalanced in general toward the bottom half. Most of his houses were symmetrical, but not all of them. Okay, then we have the shadows. Again, that's part of the design here for shade, in the warm summer months, so that people can be cool outdoors outside on their deck. And that's from the sun, so natural modeling from the shadows created by the sun. And the lines are visual. There's no carved line here, especially on the windows. You can see the framing creates line. And then here, just very faint lines at the corners. The largest mass, well, that's hard to say. If you count the walls as one mass, the stone part of the walls, I mean, then that would be the largest mass. And then it would be the bottom deck and then the middle deck on the second floor, right? But, square footage wise, I don't have those figures. So you can just say in this photo, it appears that the outer walls of stone are the largest mass, and then it would be the lower deck because it's much wider, and then the third largest would be the middle story, the upper deck. Okay, and then we have stable. Again, it's totally stable. There are no dynamic lines, but it looks dynamic from most angles because of the sweeping lines of those concrete decks and the row of windows, but it technically is completely stable. There's no round or curved shapes anywhere in it. Let's see, are we forgetting anything? Balance, rhythm, stable, modeling. I think I'm forgetting something. I think always I think of one more feature when I move on. Okay, so I guess let's go back because now I skipped ahead here. Okay. Oh, space. Kind of important. Sorry. For space, it's a 3-story house. This has low ceilings. Right was only 5'6". You don't have to write that, but it was short, even for that period of our history when most of the males were shorter. He was shorter than the average man. So he often had lower ceilings. And that's one criticism some people made of his houses. So the ceilings are only about 8 feet tall. Well, that's tall enough for most people. Some members of the MBA couldn't live here, but anyway, the point is that the ceilings are relatively low, lower here than they were in his prairie houses. They weren't high then either, but he even had them lower because it's cheaper, of course, because if you have 3 floors and each floor is not as tall, there's less material. You can see how that would supposedly, at least theoretically, lower the cost. So the ceilings, there's 2 large rooms, right? One above the other, this room and this room here, which are an open flowing floor plan, right? And then many smaller divided rooms in the back with about 8-foot high ceilings. That's how you write about space. Okay, let's go on now to a totally different architect. And here we go. This is the next one, Maybeck, M-A-Y-B-E-C-K. And this is First Church of Christ Scientist. If you want to say First Christian Science Church, that's the other way to say it. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a church that's the Christian Scientist, or even know anyone who's ever, gone to that Christian denomination. They call themselves both ways. Their churches are usually described as either First Church of Christ Scientist, that's what this is in Berkeley, or First Christian Science Church. The reason is they usually in big cities have more than one. And this is the first one. So I'll say it again. First Church of Christ Scientists. It sounds like they're saying Jesus was a scientist, but that's not what they mean. They thought of themselves as a scientific version or variation of Christianity. 1910. Okay, why are we looking at a church in Berkeley that I'm sure most of you never heard of? This is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's applied for and will probably get admitted to the UNESCO list. It isn't yet, the last I checked. Why? Because it is an example of the first movement of, and I gave you it in that list on Monday, that's in your list of terms to know, the first movement of American or early, just say early modern architecture to be green. I don't like that phrase because it doesn't tell you anything. In other words, environmentally integrated. This building integrates with its site so much that the first time I lived across the street from it for my whole senior year at Berkeley, I didn't even know it was a church. I thought it was just a very long, rambling house with a fancy entrance. It's a church, a Christian Science church. It integrates with the site in a very unique way. The site has redwood trees. You can see a little bit of that here. And it has a lot of vegetation that were on the site before the church was designed. But the main thing that it does is use a combination of modern, this is part of the meaning now, Maybach, the architect, created the first Bay tradition. That is part of that list I gave everyone on Monday. You do need to, maybe you'll be asking the true false section what the final, that the first Bay tradition included the following features, and then if they're all correct, it's true, right? And if one of them isn't, it's false. So we'll just give you the, again, about three main features, even though there are more than that. I wrote my master's thesis on this movement and this architect, Maybach. So just say Maybach was the founder of the first Bay tradition movement, which meant the buildings were integrated with their site, right? Or the environment, let's say it either way. And second is they used a combination, these buildings, of modern building materials, metal frame windows, concrete columns, and historic decorative motifs. This is a Gothic window. If you look closely, you can see the pointed arches here. And then this is Japanese. Some of you know enough, maybe seen pictures of Japanese architecture or, scenes of Japan in a movie or something. That's a traditional Japanese overhanging roofline. So he used it, I'll say it again, the second feature Maybach introduced in the quote first Bay tradition movement, besides integrating the buildings with their site. So they looked like they blended in to a large degree, of course, with the surrounding. The second one was a combination of modern building materials with historic decorative motifs, or you could say details if you prefer that word, means the same, details, such as the Gothic arch window, the Japanese overhanging roof lines here. And then the final thing is, that I'll give you now, is that each building was a unique design. No two first Bay tradition buildings were alike. You wouldn't say that about Wright. Wright's buildings, especially as Usonians, a lot of them look almost the same with, minor changes, of course, for the interior and or the colors or something. But many of his buildings, both the Prairie and especially the latter Usonian, were very, very similar. Whereas with first Bay tradition design, each building is uniquely designed. And that's because the architects like Maybach, who were in that movement, believed that you should take into account everything about the lifestyle, or you could say life patterns of the client. Well, this isn't a house. So why is this unique? Well, I just mentioned a couple of reasons. No church before this, at least not in California, had combined modern material like concrete, right? And metal sash windows like a factory. They even call them factory sash windows with historic detailing, Gothic stonework. Well, actually, it's concrete made to look like stone. And then wooden overhanging Japanese roof lines. No other architect for churches had ever done that. But the other thing is it's fire resistant. You can't say fireproof. There is no such thing. Fire resistant, because their previous church, this group, this Christian Science congregation, had lost their previous church to a fire, an accidental fire. So when they hired Maybach, they said, you got to make the building fire resistant. So that's why he used on the outer walls these modern materials of metal framing windows, very thick glass, by the way, imported from Belgium, but that's unusual, but just that they were fire resistant materials. And he even had asbestos paneling on the upper walls, which you can't see in this photo. I don't have a detail of that. But this building was so ahead of its time that, again, it did influence the design of churches all over the United States, not too much overseas, but in other parts of the US. So Maybach is considered by many historians to be the first green architect, what today we call green or environmentally sensitive architect. Others would argue Wright deserves at least equal credit, and you could make that case. But certainly he's the first architect on the West Coast to even think of that. And the last fact about him, it's going to relate to the last two must-knows we'll see as we finish up today, is that his other role was as the mentor, and he was a mentor and friend, lifelong friend of Julia Morgan. He encouraged the first woman architect in America to have her own practice, to go out and accomplish what it took. And we'll get to her in just a few minutes. She had to overcome all kinds of prejudice. Women weren't supposed to design anything, certainly nothing more than a small house. They almost never could have been hired, and none of them had their own offices. They all had to work with male partners until she came along. We'll talk about that, and I'll repeat that in a way that relates to the meaning of the last two slides by her. So just say for now, last fact on this meaning of this slide is that Maybach, actually you should say it this way, he started the architecture program at UC Berkeley. There were no architecture classes at the university in the 1890s, none. So he was the only architecture instructor there, and he founded the architecture school, which is world class. Anybody who's graduated from that school of architecture has got a head start on a good career. It's very competitive to get into, and it's world famous. So he started the architecture program at UC Berkeley, and one of his first students in that program was the first woman architect, independent, we have to say, woman architect ever in America, Julia Morgan. And he encouraged and supported her whole career, and they were lifelong friends. So we'll do a formal analysis. If it's on the exam, I'll use this closer view because it's the largest image I could find on the internet for these slides. Balance, yes, it's symmetrical, but it feels unbalanced towards this side only because of the way this photo is. But if you were to walk around the corner and look at this, it's rough, just say roughly balanced left to right. But you could say it's weighted unbalanced somewhat toward the bottom, of course, because the roof line on this wing, the one we're looking at, is nowhere near as wide as the walls above, below it. So it's unbalanced to the bottom and roughly balanced left to right. The rhythm are these brackets here, right, under the overhanging roof line. The Gothic concrete made to look like stone. Gothic trim or tracery is the right word, but you can just say trim, decorative trim. And of course, the windows create rhythm, the tiles on the roof, and then the concrete columns. So there's a lot of rhythm. It is both stable and dynamic. It's stable in that it's very horizontal in terms of the floor plan. It's much wider, obviously, than it is tall, but it's dynamic in most other ways. Obviously, this is dynamic, this Japanese overhanging roof line, or some people call that the porch. That's what the church calls it, this area of the porch. But you can just say roof line. And the windows with the Gothic decorations on them, clearly those are dynamic. But the windows, the walls themselves, the lower windows, the walls, and of course the columns, those are stable. So it's both. Textures. Here we have some simulated texture on the concrete made to look like stone. So it's simulated to look like stone. But everything else is real smooth glass in the windows with real smooth metal, real rough concrete on the columns, real rough wood, right? There's a very little cement texture. It's really only right here. But real rough wood texture on the overhanging roof line, and real smooth texture on the roof, the tiles, which are, by the way, Spanish colonial style. So he's mixing several historic motifs. That's another thing that you don't have to write it, but that marks Bay tradition, that they didn't only just do one single style on any of their buildings most of the time. Certainly Maybach did. He would often mix different styles in a way that blended, aesthetically. It works. It, isn't a single architectural style or borrowing from any one historic style. It's a mixture. Japanese, Spanish, colonial, Renaissance, he's calling it Renaissance detailing. But you don't have to add that. You have enough on the meeting. So to wrap it up, let's see. Now we have for space. There's a large auditorium that holds 650, or you can just say 650 seats, which will blow your mind. It literally will. If you ever go here at noon, extra credit, new option. Every day of the year, even if it's Christmas Day, well, this year Sunday isn't on Christmas. Christmas isn't on Sunday, but any Sunday, regardless of what day of the year it is, if you show up at 12 noon, there will be a guide. If there's only one or two people, maybe, but if you have 5 or more people, and there almost always is, this is such a famous building, you get a guided tour that is really worth it, and it is beautiful inside. The cover of my book on Mabec, I meant to show you that. I don't have it with me here. Maybe next week I'll hold that up to the screen. Has the interior of this church is the cover of that book, because it's so beautiful. So inside, once again, for space, there is one large auditorium that holds 650 people, and many smaller rooms arranged around that, meeting rooms, reading rooms, offices, so forth. Okay, let's see. Stable, obviously there's the rhythm. I think we covered most texture. Oh, modeling, yeah, for here and line. The modeling is just the natural shadows from the sun. This is not part of the design in this building. And then we have the line is visual, of course, around the window, right? Framing and at the corners and edges of the columns and the building itself. So there's no carved, well, there's a little bit, but you can't see it here. And definitely no painted line. Okay.
Are you on the color of that?
Well, I was saying earlier, it's warm on the wood. Yeah, I'll repeat that. I don't know. I thought I said that. I might have not. Wood is the warm, of course, brown, and the upper floor, in other words, upper part, the roof line is warm mostly, because of course we have a red clay tile and warm brown wood. But most of the rest is cool, isn't it? With the gray concrete or off-white and the white, and this is white metal framing on the windows. And the walls are asbestos, which is a gray color. You can't quite see that here, but right here, that's the fireproof part. Yeah, this church has had several near brushes with fires. Some of the people don't write this here. Across the street is People's Park. Some of you know Berkeley enough to know what that is. Yeah, it's basically a giant homeless outdoor camp. Has been for decades since, should I say this yeah, I was in a crowd when some of the people in the crowd tore that fence down in 1971, I think it was. There'd been a fence around it, but the university owns it, right? And they've not done anything with the plot of land right next to this church. So there's quite a few cases where I hope it's accidental. Fires have almost started where at night, 2 or 3 in the morning, someone lights a fire right in front of the door or something. And luckily it never caught the building on fire, partly because it was designed by Mabec to be fireproof, but fire resistant. Okay, I think we covered every element here. So let's go on to, now this building you should know, or isn't really a building. Well, the building behind it is, and that's the Palace of Fine Arts. Let's go up close. There is a museum in there. Well, it used to be a museum. I don't know what it is now. It was called the Exploratorium. Some of you probably went there as kids, right? Or with your own kids. But it was originally built for the World's Fair of 1915. So this is the next must know. Oh, did I not put it on here? Oh my goodness, I'm giving you guys a break. Okay, you don't have to take notes then. This is the Palace of Fine Arts. It's a really good extra credit option because you don't have to have an appointment. You can just walk around it. It's all out in the open. And it was built for the 1915 World's Fair. And it's the most famous building they've ever designed because it's been in every movie since Hitchcock. That's almost, I don't mean literally, but many movies, almost. Let's say a majority of movies that I've seen that were set in San Francisco use this site as a backdrop for at least one scene. The first one, which was Vertigo. It's one of Hitchcock's masterpieces. 1956 was that or something? And the two main characters, Kim Novak and Jimmy Stewart, walk by this and they look at it and say, the portals of the past. Well, that's not what it's called, but that's what they called it in the movie. It was for the art exhibits, all the painting and sculpture exhibited in the building behind it, which Mabec designed too. But really, this is a Roman ruin sitting in the middle of a lagoon, and he designed the entire site. He even chose the swans whose descendants are still 100 years more, now 106 years later, still swimming in that pond. He literally personally supervised the entire landscaping. So he also had a skill as a landscape architect. Otherwise, it would be just a building in the middle of a concrete parking lot. That's what it was going to be until he insisted that they let him landscape the area around it, which is what makes it so popular as a park. Of course, it's now open to the public, but you didn't have to write notes on that one. Now you do. The next one, Morgan, and that's Morgan. First name was Julia. Casa Grande at Hearst Castle. I'll spell that. Some of you know Spanish and Espanol. Big house, of course. Some people think that means prison. No, in this case, it means the largest of several buildings. Some people don't know there's 16 buildings at this site. Not just this building, but it's the biggest. Casa, C-A-S-A, Grande, G-R-A-N-D-E. Casa Grande at Hearst Castle, 1925. I'm going to pause for a minute before we start the notes, partly to give your hands a little rest, and also just to check in with, has anybody listening now been to Hearst Castle? Anybody?
Yes.
Oh, okay. When were you there, and did you take? There's 4 tours, so which tour did you take?
Whatever tour took us through all the main buildings. I know you can do specialty ones that go out into what I'll call the satellite studio buildings.
The main tour is the best.
It was virtually like almost must have been like a half day. Absolutely astounding.
Yeah.
And your picture from your book you highlight my most favorite room, which is not the outdoor, but the indoor lapis blue swimming pool is just like out of this world.
Yeah, it's on the cover of my book about Julia Morgan, which, as you know, I held it up to the screen, is something you'll need to, just the 3 chapters that I wrote down in the syllabus, if you haven't already read them. And I will then summarize, of course, when we do the review, and remind people that at least one of the slides from today's lecture, as I just said at the start, but a couple of joined us late, will definitely be on. In fact, 2 of them probably will be on the final, and this could be one on the essay part. Why? Well, let's start with who was Julia Morgan. I said it before, but you probably didn't write it, so now you definitely should, unless you already know this. She was the first independent licensed woman architect in American history. That's not a small accomplishment. I said a few minutes ago, right? Women weren't considered competent to design buildings before her. Or if they did, they would have to do it with a male partner, either a partner, a spouse, a husband, a relative maybe, who would get the client's confidence. Of course, there's no other explanation for that but sexism. Today, 1/3 of all the architects who graduate from architectural schools, ones where they're trained well enough to be, really successful architects like UC Berkeley and Harvard and others around the world, are women. But she was the first, I'll say it again, independent, licensed woman architect in American history. What that means is that she had to first achieve a license. To get that license, she went through, I will call that HELL. I think that word's acceptable on the internet because it's going to be posted. She went through hell, by which I mean, it's part of the meaning now. She had to overcome the sexism of the Paris Architecture School, which isn't there anymore. But back then it was the top architecture school in the world, and Mabeck had gone there. So he recommended she apply. No women were even allowed to audit, not even sit in on their architecture classes. They weren't allowed to join the painting and sculpture program, but not the architecture program. She took the test, the entrance exam, 3 times. She passed all 3. And after she was failed the second time, knowing that her score was above many of the male applicants who were admitted in the same, group, she got a little suspicious, and she asked why am I not being admitted? And the head of the architecture program looked her in the eye. It's a very famous quote. It said, it's because, you don't have to write the quote now, but just so you understand what she had overcome. It's because we do not wish to encourage young ladies in our profession. It was the wrong thing to say to Julia Morgan. She was an extremely determined person. She had to wait a year. So she stayed in Paris during that 2 years waiting to get in, and was already getting commissions, even though she didn't yet have a license, because she was so good at what she did. She learned under Maybach, you see, at UC Berkeley, but she didn't have the license yet. So the third time she passed in the top 3% of the applicants that were supposed to accept the top 10%. So they were too embarrassed to keep her out. That was the École Beaux-Arts. You don't have to write the name of it, but if you want to know, the top school of architecture in the world was the one in Paris. École, French for school, ECOLE, Beaux-Arts. I mean, beautiful art, BEAUXARTS, but you don't have to have that in your notes, or if you do, it doesn't have to be spelled exactly right. If you choose to mention that fact, it's an important fact of who she was. So what does that have to do with this building? Well, by the time William Randolph Hearst, who was one of the wealthiest men in America, some historians say he was the third wealthiest, but that's hard to prove. They didn't have the same numbering system, and they didn't have income tax when he was early on in his career. Just say one of the wealthiest men and the first media mogul. No question, he was the first media mogul, which is the term that is used way too liberally now. But people obviously that run various media outlets are called media moguls. So he was the first owner of mass media. He owned newspapers, radio stations, movie studios, magazines. He was a billionaire, one of the first billionaires, you could say it that way, in America. He wanted to build a retreat for himself and his wealthy friends or guests to stay at, along with his mistress and his 5 sons when they chose to visit him. So he hired Julia Morgan, who by the time he hired her to design this, she was already famous because she had built so many buildings all over the Western US. She didn't just work in the Bay Area of California. Her buildings are in Hawaii, in Utah, in the Northwest. I forget exactly where, but definitely all over Northern Southern California. So he hired her when she was already an established architect. But that right there says a lot about the fact that he was more open-minded than you might think. A lot of his critics at the time would say, he was, biased in sadly so many common ways at that time, but at least he was open-minded to talented women, because he also hired women that Julia Morgan recommended to do the painting and plastering and some of that work, which is traditionally men's work too. So at least he had that much of an open mind. And she spent the next 30 years working on this, and it was never finished. Now, this is just the largest building. This is all part of the meaning. Now, Hearst Castle implies to most people just this structure. And I imagine, it was that John, that this is all that you would, that's enough. There are 55 rooms inside, so it's part of the meaning, 55 rooms. And it has a 60,000 square foot interior. That includes not only the 55 rooms, but a huge wine cellar in the basement. And also private movie theater, several libraries. I mean, it goes on and on. If you took the tour, right? I don't know if it was just one of you that did. And 2 dining rooms, 2 different dining rooms. And of course, his own private suite, as well as guest rooms. Okay, so just summarize, say that this was the largest private or residential, you say either, or private compound on the West Coast. For decades, it was the largest private compound on the West Coast. Now it's been overtaken by, I can never remember his name, Bill Gates. Yeah, there we go. And I have no idea what his looks like. Not like this. I heard it's concrete bunker. But this is not only one building. The Hearst Castle is just a generic term that's been kind of not really correctly used to describe the whole complex of 16 different buildings, including the indoor pool that you were talking about, I guess, John, and an outdoor pool that's been used in movies for decades. Both pools have, as well as guest houses and other structures on the site. So there's 16 buildings on this site. And that's why it's the largest residential compound on the West, or it was for many decades. And he held many parties here that became legendary, famous parties. Charlie Chaplin came here, Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn. I mean, Alfred Hitchcock, all kinds of famous directors and actors and artists and authors would come and stay a week or so at a time. Okay, so there we go. Welcome back. We were just doing, this is an important slide, it has a high, I'll even say probability of being on the final. Again, I'll briefly repeat the title, but I think we're about to wrap up on the meeting. Julia Morgan, Casa Grande at Hearst Castle, 1925. So the only other thing to say about this is that this part of California, you know, if you've driven down the coast, Highway 1, right, is right in central California. And it has a high earthquake incidence or frequency, I guess you could say. And in this structure and all the others, so a total of 16 buildings on that site designed by Julian Morgan, were never damaged in any of the earthquakes. There's been some good size, not a big one like the 1906 quake has ever happened again, and it probably will eventually. In other words, she was also an engineer. She was trained first as an engineer before she then decided to take the architecture class that Maybeck taught at Berkeley. No women were taking engineering classes. Actually, there were two before her, and they never even tried to practice because they knew they couldn't get jobs. Well, she applied her engineering skills to all her larger public buildings or even private ones, of course, private. Well, quasi-public because so many people came to visit, but technically private. So she did, for instance, the bell tower at Mills College in Oakland, which is the oldest women's college on the West Coast. If you don't know about it, there's a whole chapter on it in my book. Beautiful campus, about to become co-ed, by the way, the college, Mills College in East Oakland. The bell tower there was 03. Of course, that's 3 years before the big quake. Not a crack in it. After the earthquake, when all kinds of buildings all over the East Bay and San Francisco and the peninsula collapsed, of course, in the 06 quake. So she was a brilliant engineer as well as the first independent female architect. And this building has survived, as have the others on the site. All kinds of tremors and earthquakes that have damaged other buildings in that area. Okay, that's plenty on the meaning. And then we'll be able to finish right on time with one more Julian Morgan slide. Okay, so this is cool, of course, in color, except for the overhanging, again, Japanese influence here, right? Wide overhanging eaves with the wooden brackets and the clay tiles. But most of the tiles, let's go up to the bell towers, are blue and white tiles around these are not real bells, by the way. They're just decorative. It's meant to look like a Spanish Renaissance church, not a mission. Some people think it looks like mission. There's no mission this fancy. This would be like Baroque era, meaning, 1600s architecture in Spain proper, or some parts of Mexico where they imported that stuff. And it is not a hodgepodge. It was criticized for being a hodgepodge in some architecture guidebooks when, let's say 50 years ago or even earlier. I mean, more recently. People saying that don't know what they're talking about. This is a very consciously the style of Spanish Renaissance revival. Okay, so those towers, of course, are they the largest? I would say they're the largest mass, but it's a hard, if you count the towers, because towers by definition have a foundation. If that's, as many people would, technically they are a single structure from the ground to the top, then those are the two largest masses. And the second largest would be the central or pavilion. It's called central section or wing, the entry wing, you could say that. And these two are equal, so there's no third largest mass if you divide it that way. For space, I just told you, but I'll repeat that. It has 55 rooms plus a wine cellar with about 60,000 square feet of space. Plus the two towers are 165 feet each. Obviously, they're identical. Is it balanced? Yes, left to right, but unbalanced pretty clearly towards the bottom. Here the textures, a real smooth texture of plaster over concrete and real smooth glass, but also real rough wood, of course, on the overhanging roof line there, and then real smooth tile on the towers. So they're all real textures. There is some cement texture, but it's hard to see in this slide. And I'm not going to use this close up where you can't see the towers if it's on the exam. There is some cement texture around the doorway of these statues, sculptures of knights in armor, from the time that the Spanish conquistadors wore armor. But you can ignore that because it's hard to see. But there is clearly carved line that you would definitely need to say all around the door, across the entire facade and the balconies. And then the visual line is always at the corners. And then, of course, the modeling is very strong on where the sun creates the shadows on the overhanging roof line or balcony. These were his private, where he and his mistress would live when they were there. He had several houses, all designed by her, by the way, all over California. This was his favorite. Okay, let's see. Are we forgetting anything? Color, texture, modeling, line. Oh, dynamic. Well, the towers, at the top of the towers, but mostly, and of course the overhanging the roof above the balcony, but mostly it's stable. It's, very straight lines on the whole bottom 3/4 or so. Okay, last slide for today. Again, by Julia Morgan. I've already told you who she was, so we don't need to recap that. Administration building at Asilomar. Administration course building at Asilomar. That's ASILOMAR. 1913. Anybody here been to Asilomar? It's in Pacific Grove in Monterey County. Anybody here been? It's open to the public. You can stay there, and they're beautiful rooms. They used to be $99 a night, including a really good full breakfast. I mean, really good in their dining hall. She designed 17 buildings, I think it is, something like that. Say, it was 16 buildings, and there were almost all of them. I think one was torn down. So just say nearly all of the original buildings are intact. She designed them for a women's club. It was originally part of the YWCA as a retreat for women who were members of the Young Women's Christian Association. That's why you just keep it simple and write those initials. The YMCA is the male version, right? The YWCA chapter in that area hired her to design a retreat, but that was always going to be open to anyone. There are all kinds of famous professional groups of scientists and doctors, professors, movie producers have their conventions here because there's so many different buildings around here that can hold hundreds of people each, and the dining hall is huge. It's beautiful. So you could stay there, but nobody here has been there. Okay, it's on multiple, I don't remember how many acres, but it's on the water. Every building has a view of the Pacific Ocean. So these are First Bay tradition buildings. If it's not obvious, though Julia Morgan was one of the main practitioners of First Bay tradition, when the building integrates with its site and the materials, right, are natural, right, materials blended with historic and modern materials also blended with historic detailing. The only thing about this is not even at all Bay tradition, is, maybe some of the materials are fairly modern. But it does not blend with its site. It was the antithesis of that, because that's what the client asked the architect, Julia Morgan. Hearst's point for building that was to show off his wealth, of course, and his so-called taste or good taste. That's not at all the concept behind First Bay tradition, which you already covered with the Christian Science Church by Maybeck. This is a First Bay tradition building. That's part of the meaning. Since where the administration offices are, and it always has been where people have to check in if they're going to stay there. And then they can, rent rooms. Of course, I think you have to RSVP. It's a pretty popular spot if you want to stay in that area in Pacific Grove. So it still functions as an administration building, but now this is no longer owned by the YWCA. Pretty sure that's right. Some kind of, trust owns the land and the buildings, but they are open to the public, either just to walk through and visit the sites and each building, or to rent rooms and stay, either as individuals or part of a group. So that's the function. It does not change. The function is the same as we know for. In 1913, this was ahead of its time, because here we have the sweeping lines of prairie. So she was influenced by Wright, the long horizontal lines, right? And the minimal ornament. But it's different than anything Wright did in terms of the materials. This is Carmel Fieldstone. They just call it Carmel stone from right there on the site. And then wood shingles, of course, and wood tiles, and not wood tiles, wood siding, I should say, wood siding and wood shingles on the roof. All natural local materials from the environment around it, and it's meant to integrate with this site and this setting. So it's a First Bay tradition building. Again, very little ornament, but what there is just Japanese mostly influence. This whole area looks like a Japanese tea house. So she was also, like Maybeck and Frank Lloyd Wright, inspired by the simplicity of Japanese architecture. So she incorporated those kind of motifs into many of her buildings. Okay, that's pretty much the whole meeting. So let's wrap it up. We'll end probably right on time, and then I'll stick around for any questions you may have. Okay, so formal analysis, it is totally symmetrical. her buildings were almost always symmetrical because that's what they taught at the École Beaux-Arts, and she preferred symmetry to asymmetry. So in other words, she and Frank Gehry wouldn't see eye to eye, if you know what I'm talking about. If you know Frank Gehry's jagged edged look. I mean, I know he's like the #1 architect in the world today in terms of his fame and his knowledge and reputation. People have heard his name, and even these Simpsons have had him as a character on some of their episodes. She's not as well known as she should be, but she's getting more well known as time goes on. She's starting to get recognition from, various heritage groups and things like that. But anyway, so let's just do the rest of the formal analysis. Totally symmetrical, completely balanced, mostly stable. She didn't do a lot of dynamic detail, but the two things are dynamic are the main roof line, the high peaked gables, and the entry porch or portico with its, peaked roof. So those are dynamic, but everything else is stable. And the color's all warm, isn't it? She loved warm colors. She rarely used cool colors. Naybeck would do some of both, but he preferred warm colors as well, as did Wright. But hers almost never used cool. I don't see anything cool here because even the roof tiles or shingles, I meant shingles, have a warm, natural kind of light tan color. And all the textures are real smooth glass. Of course, here you have those walls of windows are banded. They're called B-A-N-D-E-D. You don't have to write that word, but that's the technical term for windows side by side with no wall between them. But anyway, just extra wide rows or bands, B-A-N-D-S, of windows. That creates, of course, that is the real smooth texture of glass. But all the other textures are rough, real rough stone, real rough wood, framing and siding, and then real rough shingles, wood shingles. There's no carved line or drawn line. There's only the visual line around the edges of the buildings, the framing of the building at the corners. And of course, that's created by the modeling, the natural shadows from the sunlight. And let's see, is it a single mass? I would say so. Well, you could break it down and say the main walls, right? And then the entry porch, and then I suppose you could say the chimney if you want, because it is a separate structure. Or if you think of it as one single structure, which it really is, you could just call it one large mass. Let's see, and then the rhythm, I think I mentioned that, right? The repeated shapes of the windows, the peak gables, and these are called dormers when they're stuck along the roof line. So those are the offices upstairs for the administration that runs this complex, this site. It's really a convention center. That's what it's called now, the Asilomar Convention Center. And so they have to have offices to do their work, and those have views, really beautiful views of the Pacific Ocean, which is just a few hundred yards away. Okay, am I forgetting anything visual? Let's see, balance, texture, modeling, and I think I said the lines were visual, especially around the windows. You notice that. Okay, we're right at 4:15. So let's go ahead and do the stop share. And then I'll answer any questions you have. And again, if you joined late, I know a couple people did, and I understand that that's part of life. You do want to watch the first part of this because I said a lot about Wright's Roby House, the first modern house. Most historians call it the first slide for today. So if you did miss that, even though you saw maybe all the rest of the slides, might not feel the need to go back and watch this whole lecture on video, but you should watch the parts you missed, because for sure, at least I'm going to tell you now, 2 of the slides from today will be on the final, either in the slide analysis short essay part, right, or the slide ID section. Okay, any questions anybody has about what we covered today, or extra credits or grades or anything else?
Mark, on that last building, I'm assuming from a space standpoint, it had one large room and then surrounded maybe
You guys
a couple of
need
smaller.
to call me on that. I apologize. Space. That's terrible. Here I am, the architecture story. I forgot. Space. That was one of the 9 elements I forgot. Yes, it is one large open room. And it has huge walk-in fireplaces, and there's always fires going day and night. It's a wonderful place. If you're down around Monterey, take a look. It's just, you'll get an idea why Julia Morgan she's considered one of the 10 most influential architects in America now. Not when she was alive. Well, maybe when she was toward the end of her career, but after she died, she got forgotten. she got forgotten. Can you believe Life magazine wrote a whole feature, or published a whole feature article on Hearst Castle, and they didn't mention her name once in the article. And my mentor, the man that ran the art history program at Cal State East Bay, where I got my master's, about her in Maybach, he wrote an angry letter, bless him, for doing this back when nobody cared. So what he knew that she should have gotten credit to the editors, and they printed a retraction, or what do you want to call correction, the next issue. Oh, okay, we might have wanted to mention that it was the first woman in American fiction to design a whole complex. Yes, so I'll say it again. Last thing on space for the formal analysis of that last slide is that it is one large, open, you could say free-flowing room where guests you could just park there and just, whatever, just chill out or bring something to eat. There's gift shops at either end. So there's smaller rooms at either end. One is the check-in room, when you check in if you're staying there, and at the other end is a gift shop. And then there are offices upstairs in what looks like the attic. So it's mostly, the space is primarily one large, long open room with two smaller rooms at either end, and then a couple rooms upstairs.
Yep. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot that. Kind of important. Okay, but I know that, we're down to, what is it, 5 weeks? So actually it's 4 now after this left. So we still have a lot more of architecture to cover, and then I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a break or breather at some point before the end. I think it will be the second to last week before we review for the final. I will show you some slides. I started the show when my laptop stopped charged, ran out of battery charging, whatever. I forgot to bring my cables. One or two of you remember that, but I had gotten through the 2 late African sculpture slides I intended to show. I didn't get to those. Those are from a world art collection, which overlaps with everything we've covered this semester in the second half at the Art Institute of Chicago. They opened a whole new wing of world art collections from all over the world. And so those will be just for your own enjoyment. And that'll be the last set of slides that we see before we review for the final. But for now, any questions, again, from anything we've covered today, or anything about extra credit, your grades, or anything else? If not, of course, anything you think of, for instance, if you didn't get a grade from one of the assignments you submitted, well, I haven't yet had time to grade the papers, obviously. Those are going to be graded within the next 10 days, I would say, probably. I should have those grades, well, right after Thanksgiving, hopefully before we meet on the Monday after Thanksgiving, but certainly they should be before the 1st of December. All of you should get, who turned your papers in on time, an email with a description of what you did, how you did, what you missed, and your final grade for that second paper. Okay, anybody else with any other questions, comments, additional? And not too many people, nobody's done 30 points even, let alone 60 for extra credit yet. Well, maybe one person has. So you still have, up to 60 points. If you haven't done any of those extra credit, or only a couple, you can continue to gather extra credit points if you want, as a margin, if you want to call it, a cushion for your final grade. And that is good up until the end of final exams week. But if you didn't do your second paper, now it's 10 points off. It doesn't go up. Don't forget the deadline for that is the week before, I'll say the weekend, and I'll send you an email to remind you, like Sunday before final exams. I can't accept late papers during final exams. There's too much grading that I have to do in a too short a time. So keep that in mind. If there are people I haven't yet received the second paper from, it doesn't go up anymore. And at 10 points off, you could still get 85 or 90 on it, and then add 10 points or so for extra credit, and you made up the difference. Okay, anybody else have any questions about anything we just discussed? All right, I will see you all next Monday. All right, so have a good weekend. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
You guys take care. Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.